Pike County, Kentucky, March 7th, 1911. 7 in the morning. Behind the east face of a limestone shelf at the base of Johns Creek Hollow, 61 feet below the ridge road, the air that had been sealed since before any man in Pike County had a name for this land came out cold and dry and smelling of something Elijah Marsh had never smelled in 22 years of preparing the dead. He had smelled every variety of death a small mountain county could produce, the mine disasters, the winter fevers, the old men who went in their sleep. And he knew the specific character of air that had been enclosed with organic material for a long time. This was not that smell. This was older. This was the smell of a room that had been sealed before anything organic was left to decay. He was 44 years old. He had been the undertaker in Pikeville since 1889, taking over the practice from his father-in-law, who had taken it from his, making the Marsh family the county's primary mortuary service for 3 generations. His profession had given him a specific and practical knowledge that no physician in Pike County possessed. He knew the human body as a physical object to be measured, arranged, and documented. He kept ledgers. He kept measurement records. He had been keeping them since his first year in practice, because a coffin built to the wrong dimensions was a professional embarrassment, and because Elijah Marsh did not commit professional embarrassments. The opening in the limestone face had been found the previous afternoon by a road crew widening the hollow track for coal wagon access. The crew foreman, a 31-year-old man named Samuel Blevins, who had worked mountain roads in Pike County his entire adult life, had sent his youngest worker up the hollow on horseback to fetch Marsh before sundown, because Blevins had looked through the opening with a lamp and understood immediately that what was inside was not a natural cave and was not empty. He had not gone in. He had posted his crew at either end of the hollow and sent for the undertaker, because in Pike County in 1911, when you found human remains, you sent for Elijah Marsh. Marsh went in alone at first light. But here's what the Kentucky Bureau of Vital Statistics and the Bureau of American Ethnology have spent 114 years making sure you never ask about. Pike County occupies the extreme eastern tip of Kentucky, pressed against the Virginia and West Virginia borders in the heart of the Cumberland Mountains. In 1911, it was coal country. The Elkhorn coal field ran through the county's southern reaches, and the hollow roads that the coal companies were grading and widening in the first decade of the century were cutting through terrain that had been largely inaccessible since European settlement. The mountains above Pikeville were not well surveyed. The geological survey crews that had worked the region in the 1880s and 1890s had followed the creek drainages and the established ridge lines, mapping the coal seams and the limestone formations most relevant to extraction. The hollows between the ridges, the narrow ravines cut by seasonal streams that fed into Johns Creek and its tributaries, had not been surveyed in detail. What was in those hollows had not been asked about. Elijah Marsh knew this geography the way a man knows the land around the town where he has worked for 22 years. He knew the hollow above Johns Creek. He had walked it twice on deer hunting trips in the late 1890s. He had not noticed the limestone shelf at its base because the shelf was unremarkable from the outside, a standard outcropping of the gray limestone that characterized the formations on that side of the ridge, nothing to distinguish it from 100 similar outcroppings in the county. What distinguished it was what the road crew's grading had exposed, a seam in the face of the shelf, horizontal and clean, running for approximately 9 feet along the rock face, at a height of about 4 feet from the current ground surface. The seam was not a natural fracture. The road crew foreman Blevins had recognized this immediately. Natural fractures in limestone follow the stone's internal stress lines, which in these formations ran at angles to the horizontal. This seam was level. It had been cut. Marsh went through the opening at 7 in the morning with 2 lamps and his measuring tape, the same tape he used for coffin measurements, a good quality linen tape he had owned since 1892 and trusted completely. The chamber behind the cut seam was approximately 18 feet in length, running back into the limestone at a slight downward angle, 11 feet wide and 8 feet at the highest point of the ceiling. The ceiling was not natural stone. It had been worked. the same smooth, parallel striations he would later note in his record book, running perpendicular to the chamber's long axis, uniform in depth and spacing. He had been in natural limestone caves in Pike County before. He had never seen a limestone cave with a worked ceiling. What was on the floor of the chamber is what he had come for. There were 4 of them, arranged on their backs along the north wall, evenly spaced, with what appeared to be deliberate symmetry in their placement. The spacing between each figure was identical within an inch, and all 4 were oriented with the crown of the skull pointing toward the back of the chamber, toward the mountain. They were large. Elijah Marsh set his lamp on the chamber floor and unrolled his measuring tape and went to work, the way he went to work on every body that came through his preparation room, methodically, from the feet up. The first figure, nearest the opening, measured 8 feet and 2 inches from the heel to the crown. He measured it twice, 8 feet 2. The second, 8 feet and 7 inches. The third, 8 feet and 5 inches. The fourth, at the far end of the north wall, 8 feet and 9 inches. He measured the skull width on the nearest figure, because the skull width was the dimension that determined coffin construction more than any other, and because he was, above all things, a man who measured skulls. 6 3/4 inches front to back, 7 1/4 inches at the widest point of the cranium. His own skull, which he had measured out of professional curiosity some years earlier, was 5 1/2 inches front to back, 6 inches wide. The skull on the chamber floor was not a larger version of his skull. It was a different shape. The cranium extended further back, the brow was broader and more pronounced, and the orbital ridges above the eye sockets were heavier than anything he had seen in 22 years of preparing the dead. Above each figure, positioned against the wall at the level where the head rested, was a flat stone approximately 14 inches by 10 inches, each one bearing incised markings that Marsh described in his record book as similar to a script, but not English or any European writing he had seen. He copied the markings from the nearest stone as carefully as he could, working in pencil by lamplight, and the copy is in his record book, which is in the possession of his granddaughter, Ruth Marsh Combs of Pikeville, Kentucky. He spent 2 hours in the chamber. He measured everything he could measure. Then he went back out into the morning air and told Samuel Blevins what was inside. The eastern Kentucky coalfields in the first decade of the 20th century were in the early stages of the corporate consolidation that would define the region for the following 50 years. The companies operating in Pike County in 1911, Consolidation Coal, the Elkhorn Coal Corporation, the Pond Creek Coal Company, were expanding their extraction operations southward and eastward through the county's creek drainages, and the road grading projects that employed men like Samuel Blevins were the infrastructure of that expansion. The hollow above Johns Creek was in the survey corridor for a projected Pond Creek coal spur line that would have opened the upper drainage to extraction. The road crew that found the chamber opening was working on the preliminary grade for that spur. Elijah Marsh understood all of this. He was not a naive man. He understood that the limestone shelf his county had sat above for 120 years of European settlement occupied ground that the coal company's survey corridor had marked for extraction, and that the chamber behind the shelf occupied a position that would require either preservation or destruction in the course of that extraction. He did not know which the company would choose. He sent a letter to the Pike County Courthouse that same afternoon, addressed to the county judge, describing the find and requesting that the site be formally documented before any further roadwork proceeded. The county judge's name was William Ratcliffe. He was 62 years old, had served as county judge since 1901, and was, by the account of the Pike County Bar Association's memorial notice, published at his death in 1927, a man of careful institutional habit, who maintained meticulous court records throughout his 26 years on the bench. Ratcliffe received Marsh's letter. He sent a rider to the hollow the following morning to confirm the find. The rider returned and confirmed. Ratcliffe sent a telegram to Frankfort to the Kentucky Bureau of Vital Statistics which had administrative authority over matters involving human remains found outside of documented burial grounds. The Bureau of Vital Statistics replied within 48 hours, directing Ratcliffe to preserve the site pending a federal consultation. The federal consultation arrived in the form of 2 men from the Bureau of American Ethnology on March 12th, 5 days after Marsh's entry into the chamber. Their names, as Marsh recorded them in his letter to Ratcliffe, a letter that is in the Pike County Courthouse Records Archive, were given only as Superintendent Fowler and Agent Crane. No first names, no institutional identification beyond the Bureau name. No credentials presented to Ratcliffe or to Marsh. They spent the morning of March 12th at the site. By the afternoon of March 13th, the chamber had been sealed with a poured limestone and mortar fill that encased the opening to a depth of approximately 3 feet. The road crew had been directed to continue the grading work. The 4 figures on the north wall of the chamber were on the other side of the fill. Neither Fowler nor Crane filed a field report with the Bureau of American Ethnology that appears in any accessible institutional record. A search of the Bureau's administrative papers for the period March through June 1911, conducted by the independent researcher Gordon Ashby in the summer of 2019, identified no correspondence, no travel voucher, and no specimen receipt associated with a Pike County, Kentucky field visit. The Bureau's incoming specimen log for the spring of 1911 contains a 3-entry gap in the sequential catalog series, covering the 2nd and 3rd weeks of March. The gap is not annotated. The entries before and after it are standard accessions from documented field operations in other states. William Ratcliffe's court records for the period March through December 1911 do not contain any document formally closing the Johns Creek Hollow matter. There is no disposition order. There is no correspondence with the Bureau after the initial federal consultation reply. There is no notation that the road grading was authorized to proceed over a sealed burial site. The matter is simply absent from the record after March 13th, as if the 5 days of correspondence and the federal consultation had not occurred. Ratcliffe was a man of careful institutional habit. The absence of a formal disposition in his court records is not the absence of a disorganized man. It is the absence of a document that should exist and does not. The physical evidence that Elijah Marsh measured and recorded on the morning of March 7, 1911, cannot be accommodated by the official archaeological record of Pike County or of eastern Kentucky as a whole. The Adena culture, which the official timeline places as the primary mound-building population of the Kentucky Highlands in the period roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years before present, was documented by the Smithsonian's own field operations in the late 19th century as producing human remains in the standard anatomical range. The 4 figures in the Johns Creek Hollow chamber were not in the standard anatomical range. The smallest of them was 8 feet 2 inches. The official record assigns no population in the Kentucky Highlands at any date in the pre-contact period with anatomy of that scale. The chamber's construction presents a separate impossibility. The worked ceiling, the parallel striations Marsh described, and that Fowler and Crane presumably observed, represents a level of precision limestone cutting not documented in any Adena or Hopewell construction context. Adena burial chambers were typically earth-walled and timber-lined. The Johns Creek chamber was cut directly into the limestone substrate, with a finished ceiling at 8 feet that required both the tools and the skill to produce consistent parallel cuts across a surface more than 11 feet wide. No lithic tool set assigned to any pre-contact population in eastern Kentucky produces this class of cut. What the chamber represents, in the framework that accommodates the physical evidence, is a permanent underground construction of a technologically capable civilization whose presence in the Cumberland Mountains preceded any population the official record names. The Tartarian hypothesis places this civilization across the breadth of North America, with construction standards, precision stone cutting, sealed chambers, deliberate astronomical orientation, that appear consistently in the buried and semi-buried finds of the 1870 through 1930 suppression period. The Johns Creek chamber is one node in that documented pattern. Its orientation, the north wall placement of the figures, the crown pointing back into the mountain, matches the orientation of the sealed chambers documented in Fayette County, West Virginia in 1887 and in Ravalli County, Montana in 1923. 3 chambers, 3 states, 3 decades, the same north wall orientation. The global parallel is the burial chamber complex at Hal Saflieni in Malta, where a multi-level limestone chamber system, cut with metal-edged precision tools at a date the official record assigns to a population with no metal tools, houses the remains of thousands of individuals in a deliberate arrangement that has never been fully explained by Maltese archaeology. The land above the Johns Creek Hollow Chamber is currently held by a limited liability company registered in Delaware in 1987, with a registered agent in Wilmington whose corporate filings trace to a federal contractor specializing in land acquisition adjacent to former Bureau of Mines survey corridors. The company holds 41 acres in the hollow above Johns Creek, including the road grade that the Pond Creek coal crew was widening in March 1911, and the limestone shelf face where the seam was exposed. No commercial activity has been recorded on the parcel since the company's acquisition. The Pond Creek coal spur line projected for the hollow was never built. The parcel carries no active mining permit, no timber lease, no agricultural designation. It carries a no trespassing notice and a locked gate on the hollow road, installed in 1991. A surveillance camera mounted above the gate was added in 2016. The camera is newer than the gate. The gate is newer than the fill that sealed the chamber in March 1911. A Freedom of Information request filed in the spring of 2021 by the independent researcher Patricia Strand, requesting all Bureau of American Ethnology field records and specimen logs for Kentucky for the period March through December 1911, produced a response from the Smithsonian Institution citing the institution's operational autonomy exemption from standard federal disclosure requirements. The exemption was upheld in federal court in both 1974 and 1991. The Smithsonian's response confirmed that the institution's pre-1940 accession records were held in physical format at its archives facility in Washington, and noted that a comprehensive search of those records could not be guaranteed. The specific 3-entry gap in the spring 1911 specimen log that Ashby had identified was not addressed. The Smithsonian's response does not acknowledge the existence of the gap. The coal company's spur line that was never built would have required removal of the limestone shelf to establish the grade. The fill that Fowler and Crane directed, placed in the chamber opening on March 13, 1911, ensured that the shelf would remain intact by making its removal impractical without exposing what was behind it. A road grading crew that removes limestone fill from a chamber face in the course of standard excavation work does not expect to find a mortared plug. They expect to find limestone. The fill was not designed to preserve the chamber. It was designed to make the chamber's accidental re-exposure look like nothing more than a natural formation with some historic fill behind it. Elijah Marsh lived until 1939. He was 72 years old when he died, and he had spent the 28 years between his visit to the Johns Creek Chamber and his death in the same practice, in the same building on Pikeville's main street, preparing the dead of Pike County with the same precision he had applied to everything his career required of him. He did not speak publicly about what he had found. He spoke privately about it twice. Once to his son, Howard Marsh, in approximately 1927, when Howard was a young man working alongside him in the practice, and once to his daughter-in-law, Eleanor Combs Marsh, in the winter of 1938, when he understood that he was approaching the end of his working life. Both accounts have been preserved in the family's oral history as transmitted to Ruth Marsh Combs, his granddaughter, who was born in 1941 and who grew up hearing the story from her father Howard and her grandmother Eleanor. Ruth Marsh Combs is 84 years old. She lives in Pikeville. The record book in which Elijah Marsh made his measurements and his pencil copy of the incised markings on the stone above the nearest figure is on the shelf in her living room, in the same condition it was in when Marsh last used it, because the oilcloth cover he kept on it has preserved the pages from the humidity and the dust of 84 years. She has shown it to 3 people outside the family: a county historian in 1979 who was compiling a survey of Pike County's early settlement records, Gordon Ashby in the summer of 2019, and a documentary researcher in the spring of 2023. The county historian noted the measurements in his survey notes, but did not pursue the inconsistency with the official archaeological record. Ashby filed his Freedom of Information request 4 months after examining the book. The documentary researcher wrote a summary for an independent publication that has not yet appeared in print. The measurements are in the book. The pencil copy of the incised markings is on the page following the measurements. Marsh's handwriting is clear and regular, the handwriting of a man who kept professional records for 50 years. And the figures he recorded are not rounded estimates. They are the specific dimensions of a man who built coffins for a living, who knew that an inch of error in either direction had consequences, who measured because measurement was the foundation of his craft. Elijah Marsh, 44 years old, March 7, 1911. His measuring tape was in his left hand, and his lamp was on the chamber floor, and the figure nearest the opening was lying along the north wall in the same darkness it had occupied since before Elijah Marsh's grandfather was born, since before Kentucky was a state, since before any European boot had touched the ground above Johns Creek Hollow. He knelt beside it and placed the end of the tape at the heel and ran it toward the crown and read the number and wrote it in his book. 8 feet and 2 inches, the smallest of the 4. The fill that sealed them went in 6 days later. Behind that fill, behind the limestone shelf above Johns Creek, the 4 figures are in the same position they were in when Marsh left them on the morning of March 7th. The tape measure is gone. The lamps are gone. The man who measured is gone. The measurements are on a shelf in Pikeville. The figures are at the back wall of a chamber that has been sealed twice now. Once by whoever placed them there, and once by 2 men whose names survive only in a letter in a courthouse archive, and who left no other record of having been in Kentucky that spring. The well that Elias Croft was digging in Fayette County when the ground went hollow beneath him is 4 states to the northeast. He was a different kind of man with a different kind of tool. The measurement he made and the measurement Marsh made are the same number.